Hey team, thank you so much for joining me on the Baby Playbook podcast. Always a pleasure to hop on and record an episode. I know a lot of you know at the moment I'm in like the newborn mess with my third child, Hugo. He's doing really well. We're all very tired, but something that really I look forward to is always when I have a recording, because I absolutely love doing this podcast. I love sharing this information with you guys, just even helping parents with one thing that they might be Googling in this craziness that is parenthood. Today's episode, we have a really special guest on, and it's got a little bit of a different angle for us today. It's a little bit more about us parents rather than babies. Still tied into babies and parenthood and motherhood and fatherhood, but very much focusing on, I guess, family dynamic and relationships within the house, especially and how they change once a baby comes around. So let's do an introduction first. Biannka Brannigan joins me. She's a couples therapist who specializes in working with couples on the brink of separation, helping them rebuild connection, intimacy, and trust. Biannka, thank you so much for joining me today and making the time.
Thanks, Nicolina. Thanks for having me.
Well, today, Biannka, what we're going to be really delving into is, I guess, how relationships can change when kids come along. I know it seems like such an obvious thing, you know, that relationships will change and there might be some changes in terms of how we're feeling and moods and the amount of patience we have as people with each other. Obviously, every family household is different. But I wanted to ask you, in your experience, have you seen these big shifts in relationships at this point in time?
Yeah, definitely. I don't often see them at that point. I see couples kind of further down the road. But yes, there are significant changes that happen in a relationship once children are introduced. I like to think of it as, you know, they say that there's the most stressful times in our lives will be, you know, death of a loved one, divorce, or moving house. And I would add having children. Right.
Yeah, certainly so. Certainly so. I agree. As someone with 3 kids, even every time I think a kid is added, I've felt that shift or that adjustment in our relationship. I wanted to start pre-kids, you know, I guess as a relationship, as someone who, you know, helps relationships grow and nurture and, you know, fix where there may be problems or, you know, growing communication, what sort of conversations should we be having even before deciding to have kids with our partner to kind of prepare us a little bit, prepare our relationship a little bit for that transition?
Absolutely. One thing that I often work with clients on is mapping their relationships. So almost taking like a bit of a project management approach to the relationship, like looking at in the future, whether it's 10 years, 20 years, 50 years into the future, how do we want to feel in the relationship? How do we want to be in the relationship? And that kind of like, you know, like how do we want to be having fun? What is our, you know, what does intimacy look like? You know, what are our careers? How are we going to support each other? And then mapping that back to how do we, to get there, how do we need to behave towards each other every single day? That really helps us to get a good feel for like almost like a bit of a relational contract, for want of a better word, so that, or map, so that when we're, so that number one, we know what skills we need to behave in that way, because there's a lot goes on in relationship, right? There's all of me and all of you, and then how we meet together. So yeah, like what relationship skills would we may need now so that we can be there, and also I think that it really helps us when we do get off track, when chaos does come into our life, and we might shift a little further away from being relational. It's more of a conscious map, so we can be like, oh, hey, hang on, we didn't really agree to this. Like, how do we find our way back to our relationship and the relationship that we want to be in, rather than the relationship that we've found ourselves in?
I really like that, because it kind of gives you a point to realign to, right? Because as you say, chaos can come in, and there is no more chaos than kids. So it's like getting yourself to just realign to values, or, skills or goals that you had, something to kind of anchor you, it feels.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, if you think about it, we do it with children. We do it when we're thinking about our finances. We have plans, and we have plans like if we want to be financially at this point into the future, we know how much we need to be saving and spending in the here and now. But I find often in relationship, we don't tend to take a really conscientious approach to it. We just kind of like, we fall in love, and often we just hope for the best.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. Is it silly, Bianca, to think that that like your relationship is different and your relationship won't change, No, we're like so in love, we're so aligned, this will have no effect on us.
I don't think it's silly at all. I think it's really normal to think that, especially when we're in a really good relationship before children. And things still happen, I'm often sitting with couples who were great and they cannot understand what went wrong, and the way I think about it, just to normalize it, and it's not about fear mongering or anything like that. It's like, I think I'm just a very practical person, and I think about it in this really practical way. Like, if we're going to drive around Australia in some of the most remote, isolated and rough terrain, we're not just going to rely that the vehicle's always been good, so it's always going to be good. Like, I think we would take it to the mechanic, get the mechanic to check it out. We would have discussions about where we're heading, what we're going to do, how do we check our route and weather conditions when we don't have access to the internet. So I think that in relationship and anticipating children coming, like, what happens to us from a neurological perspective, right? The body is under, like, just for an individual, the body is under so much stress that we can often, like, number one, our window of tolerance becomes really narrow. So you're getting big nods. So there's not a lot of room for additional stress that comes into that. And so therefore it doesn't take a lot to flick us over into survival mode. And once we go into survival, the part of our brain, like the prefrontal cortex, that part of the brain allows us to be relational, to connect, to make good decisions, and to, I suppose, be a little more rational rather than emotional. And when we're under stress and in survival, that part of our brain just goes completely offline. And so the skills that we might have relied on in relationship when we were great, when it wasn't necessarily overly complicated or chaotic, we don't have access to them, because that part of our brains, it's gone. Not forever, just in, like, perhaps temporarily. It will come back online, but often, if we don't have the skills to repair, the divide between us can grow. So I wouldn't say it's silly to think that nothing will change. I think that it's great that you're so in love and the relationship feels so solid that you wouldn't anticipate things happening. But, just like we would prepare to, do that remote travel around Australia, I think it's really wise to have to have good preparation, especially the emotional stuff.
Yeah, that's such a great example. I think that makes a lot of sense when you say it, but something that you wouldn't necessarily think about. And also, I love that you've explained that neurological side of it, because I know I've experienced this as well, where I've gotten to that point where I'm like I in survival mode and I have zero patience, and I've like just ticked over to a place where I don't actually recognize myself. So it's nice to kind of know that it's not necessarily, me. It's it's something that, I can't have helped.
Exactly. And I think when we normalize that, because I think, when we flip our lids, or when our partner is, flipping their lid, we can often feel that there's something wrong with us.
Yes.
Or something is in something wrong with me, or there's something wrong with us, But when we can prepare, when we're like, okay, this could happen. And in fact, it's more than likely going to happen. Both windows of tolerance are going to be really low, or narrow. So how do we navigate that together as best we can, with the knowledge that we have now? And then even how do we navigate that? What's our safe point? As in when do we reach out for help? When do we get support?
Yeah, certainly. So then it's also not a surprise at the time, if you pull up that conversation with your partner, it's not like, oh, wow, I didn't think that this is where we would be, or I didn't think that this is what would happen. It's kind of like, okay, this could have happened. We've gotten to this point. What's the next step, Can I ask, Biannka, in your experience working with couples, are there any particularly common problems that arise when children are introduced into a relationship? Or is there any common theme in terms of frustrations that people start to experience? I'd love to delve a little bit more into kind of those types of dynamics that change.
Yeah. In addition to us going into survival mode and perhaps being more sensitive, I think when we go into that survival mode, just to expand on that a little bit more as a common issue, I suppose, that couples might see. When we go into survival, like I said, the conscious part of our brain goes offline. And so we'll be relying on old patterns and coping strategies. So that might be when you might look at your partner and think who are you? You're where did you come from? And that's because, or like you said, it's whoa, what's happening for me right now? And that's often because, either our partners, or both of us have gone to complete survival and old coping strategies. So there might be a lot of unfamiliar behavior, perhaps, and things that we, like I said before, that we may have been able to tolerate about our partner. So maybe they might be a little bit critical, or they might spend differently to how we spend money. But when our lids are on, we can tolerate that. But when we're either individually or both lids are flipped, and meaning that prefrontal cortex is offline, those things become intolerable. And or they might increase. So a person's spending may increase, a person may become more critical of the other, and it can cause a lot more ruptures and bickering in relationships. So that can certainly happen. I think there's a really common one, but it's not often spoken about, because I think it's quite subtle, which is when we might be physically present in a way that we feel like we're showing up, but in relationship, we're not actually really there for the person the way that they need us to be. So often I get couples far into the future, where resentment has really taken hold in the relationship, that leads back to when the kids were young and their partner just was not able to be there for them, and they felt really alone, isolated, and weren't able to communicate that level of like, you weren't there for me. So that can, but it's subtle, right? You know, like how we're able to communicate that to somebody, or even how do we know how to be there for that person in that way that they really need us to be. Financial stress comes up a lot. You know, like finances it's a big security thing for us. And when there's less money or more strain, or perhaps one person isn't earning either at all or not as much, it means that that person can become really reliant and dependent on another, and that can be really uncomfortable. And people deal with that in all sorts of really creative ways, some helpful, some unhelpful. What else would I say? Identity. You know, like identity gets shifted completely, both individually. Like, I think that we're not the same person that we were anymore once children come along, and that can shift the relationship dynamic or reorganize it. And when that hasn't been anticipated, it can create a real kind of disconnection in the relationship.
Yeah, certainly. I think all of those things I've felt a sense of in some regard, you know, that financial pressure, or whether it be that identity shift, or whether it be that feeling of loneliness and isolation and not knowing how to, I guess, like communicate that or ask for help or whatever it may be. One thing that I am kind of gathering from you is that one of the more important things is communication. Because once you, I guess, you know, stop that, and I guess you cut off that communication, which sometimes I think can actually be really easy to do, like to kind of retract into yourself. Do you find that that's a huge a big thing, you know, making sure that you're voicing how you're feeling and what you need?
Absolutely. One of the things that I encourage individuals in relationship is to first know like what your own experience is, so that we have some data that we can communicate. You know, like if our nervous system is really dysregulated and we can support ourselves in that, we can also ask for help from our partner, or even not necessarily even help, but giving that data. I say data, but like giving them that information so that they're more likely to either be more sensitive or support us in the way that we need to be supported. So that would be the first thing that I would say about communication. I think often too, particularly with couples that have been together for a long time, they, or maybe not even a long time, that they feel that their partners should just know how they're experiencing life. They should just know when we need support. You know, I think there's an expectation that our partners will intuit what we need, and that's, unfortunately, it's really unrealistic. And particularly, even if like before children, in the relationship, couples were able to intuit each other's needs and they were really good at that, I don't think it's fair to have the same expectation once children come along, because both people are not in their right minds anymore. You know, like there's a lot going on, and there's a lot that they're carrying. And so tuning into their partner with their nervous system might not be available to them anymore. So we have to communicate what's going on for us.
One thing, Biannka, I hear a lot about, especially with social media and as a mum myself, is this mental load that mums take on, and I say mums, but because it's assumed that it's the majority of the time. That's another thing I think is really hard, because that's sometimes really internal for mums, this constant narrative in their mind of, I need to do this, I need to do that, and I need to book this in. And then it can be really easy to kind of look at your partner and go, you're not thinking about any of this, Is that another example, though, of making sure that we're communicating that?
Yeah. And I would go as far as making that really explicit as well, like doing a brain dump of every single thing that, whoever's carrying that mental load, what they're actually carrying, because often it's such a norm that person is carrying that level of information that they can't even really articulate what that's like for them. I certainly encourage couples, like, before, like, if they've been having relationship challenges and they've come to me and then they're expecting like another baby, I talk about like these kind of 3 ways of wrapping support around the relationship. So there's like the practical things that we think about, like buying nappies and, I don't know, preparing the house and the baby space and all of that sort of thing, like those practical supports. Then there's like really looking at the structure of our life, what we're going to need to, like I think about it like a tall building, like a skyscraper, right? Like, and the structures, like all of the scaffolding that goes around the outside, so that it supports that window of tolerance that I mentioned before. So when we have all of these structural supports around, that window of tolerance can stay wider for longer. And those things are like diet, exercise, sleep, right? The things that keep us regulated. So how can we have food in the freezer, like meal preps, all of that sort of thing. And one of the things that I discuss in that structural stuff is division of labor, like who, and it's not just the tasky stuff, but it's who actually does the managing of the home. Like, who pays the bills? Who thinks about kids' pickups and what we're going to be eating for dinner for the next week? Like, who thinks about all of that stuff? Like the manager, and who's going to continue to carry that once next baby comes or first baby is arriving. And then there's a discussion of like, well, if it's, say, me and I'm going to be having the baby and I want to give that up, how do I let that go?
Yes.
As well. And trust that they're going to do a good enough job, because that can create an interesting dynamic in itself when we give over that responsibility and that person's doing a good enough job, but it's not good enough, and then they end up feeling really disempowered and not good enough. And it's interesting how that can unfold in relationship.
And I was going to say that because I can admit that I am more of the admin person at home, and sometimes when I get really overwhelmed by that, I'll voice that to my husband. I'll say, there's just so much going on, I can't handle it. And then he'll really practically go, okay, so what can I help with? And I'll just go, no, I'm just going to do it because it's easier for me to do it. And I'm sure you find a lot of us are like that, where we kind of micromanage. And, it's like there's this fear to let it go, but then it's not, you're not able to keep handling it. You need to kind of, I think, come to the realization that you need to ask for that help and also let go.
Yeah. And I mean, one of the things that I talk a lot about is good enough, like a 60-40 kind of, if they're doing a 60% good enough job, like no one is ever going to do things the way we do them. Like that's just the way it is, right? But if they're doing a good enough job, then it's good enough. And that's, we're all we all have our own way of being in this world, and I think that some of us have adapted to be perfectionists. Some of us have adapted to be in control because that's how we feel safe in life. And so to hand that over feels really uncomfortable and sometimes even terrifying. But yeah, I think it definitely deserves like a lot of discussion in the relationship about like, okay, well, how am I going to like not ask you if you've done it? Like or perhaps maybe I'm going to need a little bit of reassurance for a little while that, like you've got it, and how do we organize that? Yeah.
Yeah, certainly. Bianca, I also want to delve into, just before we finish up, romance and intimacy, which is something that kind of gets pushed to the side for a little while, especially when you have, a newborn and you're in that kind of those trenches. Any advice for couples in that sense, in, I guess accepting that, the time will come back, or little things that we can do to connect during that time?
I think that there's both. I think there's discussions that can happen before children around like again, like just kind of making it really explicit that perhaps how we connect now, and this is, I guess, more of the emotional support that we can talk about before baby comes along or babies come along. Like, how do we when do we most feel connected, and what are we doing? Is it quality time? Is it physical touch? Is it sexual intimacy? Because if it's those things, they might not be available to us for the first like 6-12 months, depending on what life looks like outside of the immediate family home, right? And then having this kind of like really explicit plan, like, okay, so if that's the case, we have to remember to turn towards each other, because I think it's very easy to become co-pilots or co-parents in relationship when chaos is kind of around, because we're so busy like trying to keep the pool floaties down under the water, that we forget each other. We forget that the other person, that we love them and that we chose them, So remembering love, remembering why we chose that person in the first place, and having rituals where, like, I think rituals are really important around when chaos, I say chaos, like when life is chaos, because rituals help us to have some sort of routine around connection. But I guess without kind of making it routine, rituals is like, how do we greet each other in the morning? How do we say goodbye to each other, in the beginning of the day? How do we arrive back into each other's lives at the end of the day? And remembering the love, and the turning towards is a big thing as well. I think, like, we can make lots of bids for connection throughout the day, and our partners may miss, or we miss, their bids for connection, and it can be as easy as like, or as meaningless as, do you want to come for a drive with me? And we might be like, oh, like, no, can't you see, like, I'm busy. But that might be our partner's way of being like, hey, I want you with me. And we can, either notice it and go with it, or be like, hey, I really want to be with you, but right now I just have to do this. I have to sleep, or I have to, I have to eat, or whatever it might be. So acknowledging the bids for connection, and staying curious, remembering that, your partner is, they're a human. They're our mate. And I think that we really forget that. And then with regards to physical intimacy, I think it's important to acknowledge that sometimes physical touch goes out the window through pure exhaustion. Sometimes there's like touch fatigue, like, I don't want to be touched anymore. For now, I just want to feel like my body is my own, and how that might affect how sense of closeness kind of either, I think when we talk about things openly and make them really explicit, they're less likely to cause more disconnection, like, oh, hey, like, I really want to, but it's just not here. And then the other thing I'd say is emotional support, because often it's that emotional intimacy that keeps us connected when everything else is not available to us. So continuing the feelings of like, oh, I'm so overwhelmed right now, like that, like naming our vulnerabilities with each other and handling them with care, I think is really important as well.
Yeah, certainly. Oh, everything you're saying, Biannka, is very, resonating a lot, because I think we don't talk about it enough, right? We don't talk about how mum and dad are feeling and how that relationship is being impacted by baby, because of course, naturally, all the focus is on this tiny little baby and how baby is going. So it's nice to bring a little bit of light to that. Thank you so much for making the time. Of course, if you guys would like to keep in touch with Biannka, I'm going to link her website and her Instagram, her socials in our show notes. So make sure you give her a follow. Make sure you head onto our website if you would like to make an inquiry as well. Thank you again.
Thanks, Nicolina. Take care, hey.